I don't know about you, but I've been having 2 great days so far. Have you been enjoying Droidcon or what? Yeah, this has been an awesome event. I'm really psyched to be part of this awesome lineup. And like 10 minutes ago, I just won a Raspberry Pi, just like that, from Facebook and Instagram. So thanks for these guys if they're in the room. Um, so this talk is going to be about activity transitions. This is a topic that I like a lot, and I really wanted to talk about this. Something that I think is very important, and let me explain you why. So if you're here today, listen to me. I'm going to assume that you're like me. You're passionate about Android, and you probably built your own apps, or at least helped build apps in the past year. So if you've done that, you probably, went with the material guidelines, tried to build those sexy material apps. And nowadays, it's really easy to do this, right? You get the design library, ready-made components, you put a little fab, a little toolbar, it's collapsible, it's all made, it's nice. And you can do that very quickly. So that's all great. The problem is that we're all the same, and we're all going to use these components. So what's going to happen, or at least the risk of it, is that we're going to all build kind of the same looking apps. So look at this app, for example. Can anyone here tell me which app this is? It's Facebook Messenger. So they recently did a redesign of their app, material redesign. And I swear this is a true story. I saw this screenshot for the first time on my Twitter feed, and someone was just saying like, "Oh, hey, look, material redesign." I just like scroll through it. I just quickly glanced at it, and I really thought this was the SMS app that we all have on our phones, which is also called Messenger. So it doesn't help. But my point is that I confused the Facebook Messenger as one of the most popular apps on the market with the stock vanilla boring SMS app. And that's the problem, is that following the guidelines is great, but at the end of the day, what you want is your app to be a bit special, right? You want to stand out. And if you just follow the guidelines, that's just not going to happen. Everybody else can do the same thing. So in my opinion, you don't want to try to be like the stock app. You want to add your own personal touch in there. You want to have something special, something that people will remember. And there's several ways to do this. If you're like me, you're a developer, you're not a designer, right? So you're not going to think about a new way, like a new design language for your app. But turns out there's a lot of little things, little details that we can add that really is going to make your app stand out. I can think of a few, like typography. You can, play a bit with your layouts. And the last one is, of course, animations. And I want to talk about a specific type of animation, which is called a transition. So a transition is just an animation to go from one screen to another in your app. So here I built a little material app, just like kind of a newsreader with, the classic tabs. And when you tap on the profile picture or the media, you would just open it and see it full screen. And the transition is the animation to go from the first screen to the second screen. So here, what would be natural? Like what feels intuitive to go from the top image? So I click on the top image to go there. Naturally, you would think, well, this is the same image. I just want to reuse kind of this view and just expand it into place. That's what would feel the most natural, right? And that is what we call a shared element transition. You're taking one element from the first activity, and you're transitioning into the second activity, reusing that element. So, of course, this shared element transitions it just doesn't happen for free. If you do nothing, the app will just look like this. So when you tap on the pictures, you get kind of this slide fade transition. This is on Lollipop. You would get something different on KitKat and something different on ICS. So that's not what's going to give personality to your app. Most people don't bother about transitions, so they just leave the default. And this is what you get. It's not terrible. It's not bad. But your users are not going to remember your app for this, right? It's just the same news reader, nothing special about it. So this is where it starts getting interesting. And this is where you can add your own little personality. And this guy can explain to you exactly what this implies. So custom activity transitions, right? We want to do that shared element so that going from activity to activity feels really natural. And so I played around with it on my little demo project here. And so I did one for the profile, which, same concept, like trying to make it seem seamless to from when you click on there to when you arrive on the second screen, everything feels natural. It's just a transformation. And this is not design. This is just logic, right? This is how to go from one view to another. And I did something a bit different for the media here. So again, reusing the image, translating it into place, and having a little bit of fun, adding this little personality with that background ripple effect, using the palette to extract the main color of the image. So just adding these two little transitions, I didn't change the app. It has the same functionality. It's not faster. Yet, when you use it, you go from like a not bad to something more like that. Or at least that's what you should aim for, right? Maybe this is a bit extreme, but this is what you should aim for your users. You want users to be excited. You want your users to remember your app. You want your users to like talk to their friends about it and be like, hey, look at this awesome stuff. And it's still a news app, it's still material, but it has a little touch, has a little personality. All right, so you guys want to know how to do this? How to make your users excited? So let's get to work, all right? Let's talk business now. How can you achieve these shared element transitions? So, I'm the same as you. Like, first thing I just go on Google and try to look what's out there. And so this is kind of my experience on it and what I found. So there's two ways to do this. The first is an official API that got released in Lollipop, but there's no backport of it, so it will only work on Android 5 and above. But it's an official API, and there's some documentation, so that's kind of nice. But last time I looked, Lollipop plus devices represent around 37% of the market, which is pretty good. It's getting better. But if you're serious about releasing your app and you want to touch as much people as possible, it's kind of a big drawback, right? There's another way, and this way is retrocompatible. It works on all Android versions, but it requires a bit more manual work, as usually is the price you have to pay for this. So let's walk through these two methods. First, the Lollipop Plus way. So this is really like you can just go on the Android website and read the documentation. So I'm going to go quickly, but I'm going to stop where the gotchas are, the things that the documentation doesn't tell you. So really quickly, if you follow the documentation, first thing they tell you to do is to add a flag to your window on the activity that you want to animate. Easy enough, right? It's all made. Second thing they tell you to do is to create this transition object, and we'll come to that in a minute. And this transition object, all you have to do is set it to your window as a shared element, enter or exit transition. So easy enough so far. That's just following the documentation. Now, this transition object, there's several ways to declare it. You can just have an XML declaration of it. So here I'm declaring a set of transitions that contain two transitions. And as you can see, like these are kind of like magic. You don't really know what it is under the hood, especially in XML. But actually, it's just a direct mapping to a Java class that you can look at. It's open source. And it's extending transition, and so you can quickly look at all the pre-made transitions that the framework gives you. And there's a bunch, all the classic ones. You get slide, you get fade, you get explode, which is an interesting one. Change bounds for changing the size of your view. Change image transform is useful in our case. So all of that is already made by the framework. You don't have to actually write any animation code. Just put a bunch of transitions, the one that work for you, and set it to your window, and you're done. The last thing you have to do is just to start that activity, obviously. And you have to pass a special bundle to that start activity, which is part of the new API. So this is only on Lollipop and above. And that bundle just takes the view from the first activity that's going to be the origin point of the transition, and a arbitrary tag that's just a string. So here is profile. And that tag you have to set to the original view in the first activity with that set transition name. That's also a new API. And you have to set the same tag to the destination view in the second activity. Pretty straightforward so far. So I tried to run this with my example where I just click on a image that's loaded from the web and try to expand it. Didn't work. And that's where the documentation ends. Literally, if you can look at the documentation, this is the last step. That's it, it should work. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? It works in a little sample project, because most of the time in the sample projects, you don't load images from a cache or from the network. And this is a key difference. You have to understand, this kind of gives the underlying, it gives a bit of the implementation detail here. So you can only, the problem was that the framework was starting the enter activity, the transition that I set, immediately after my onCreate, my activity. But at this point, I have to load some image from my cache, using Picasso or whatever. That's asynchronous. So at that moment, it's going to start the animation. But actually, my image, my destination image, the one that's going to animate to, is not loaded. It doesn't have a bitmap in it or nothing. So it's just going to end up in a weird glitch. It's going to try to animate an empty image view. And so that's something they don't tell you in the docs, but you almost always have to do this. Instead of letting the framework play the animation immediately, you have to actually tell it to postpone that animation until you're ready. All your UI is ready to have that enter animation. So thankfully, we have an API for that. They thought of it. Postpone enter transition to tell the framework to stop. And that's a little bit dangerous because if you don't call the corresponding start postpone enter transition, your activity will just be a transport layer on top that you can do nothing on it. And the only thing you can do is back out to exit this activity. So you're always going to make sure that there's a corresponding start enter transition, otherwise it will just block the UI. And so once you got that in mind, it's not that hard. You just have to kind of decouple a bit your startup code of that activity so that you start the enter transition once the image or the data is loaded. So in my case, I would wait till the callback of a Picasso or a Glide to make sure that the image view has the bitmap set at that point. So that's kind of the only real gotcha that you gotta remember, but it's a pretty big one. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. So keep that in mind. And there's a couple more APIs that the framework gives you. The interesting one is finish after transition. If you, in your activity, you have a next button or something, you generally just call finish, right? But if you call finish, the transition won't play. The exit transition will just get skipped. So you have to explicitly call finish after transition. And so you can already imagine this only works on Lollipop and above. So if you want to support previous versions of Android, you're going to have a fallback, right? You're going to have to fork your code a little bit and have those if SDK and greater than 21 bit everywhere. Thankfully, the support library actually has a bunch of these methods in it that will do the branching for you. Something to keep in mind, but so that's it. It's not much code to write. Just one gotcha to remember is that you need to have everything ready before calling the start enter transition. That's the big gotcha. And this is what I use straight up in Falcon for this profile and media transition. And yeah, it worked fairly well. Again, didn't have to write any animation code. Pretty easy to use API, but it's kind of magic. Like that's pause and resume kind of activity kind of makes you feel a bit. You don't really know what's going on under the hood. You have to really dig to understand what the framework is doing. And on some devices, it can break. I had this issue on Falcon that on Galaxy S4 Google Play Edition, the transition would just not play. No idea why. It's just like a slight difference in the implementation of in the framework or in that run that made it not work. So that's a little bit scary. And you got to know these things. And of course, it was not fun to have to do the if Lollipop, otherwise figure out a graceful fallback like the classic, more traditional transition for the older devices. So it's a pretty good API, but it has limitations, and it doesn't work everywhere. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just, this is just animations, wouldn't it be nice if you can just use the normal animation APIs and just make it work everywhere so you don't have to have two ways of transitioning to your activity in your code? Turns out there's a way to do this. And this is what I call the retrocompatible way. And it started same way. I just Googled it, see if there was a way to do it. And the best resource I found is actually this DevByte by Chet Haas, which is really, really good, which explains this activity transitions kind of the manual way. So let's try to break down into little steps what actually needs to happen in order to do this transition. So the first thing you need to do, because you need to transition from a specific place in the first activity to the second activity, you need to somehow pass that information into the second activity. So what information do you need? Basically, you just need the position and the size of the view that's going to start the animation, right? Then you're going to start that second activity, the one that's going to animate. But the trick here is that you're going to start it completely transparent. So to the user, it will be invisible. But for you, it will be a ready, perfect canvas to position something, prepare your scene, whatever your enter transition is going to be, and then play the animation. And that's it. You finish in your second activity. And that's all it needs to do. So if you think about it, we have all the tools to do this. We can pass information to the second activity via an intent. We can have transparent activities. That's been there forever. And then playing animation with the View Animator API is really easy. So let's do it. So first thing I did is make my second activity translucent. And that's all controlled via one little flag in your theme. It's called window is translucent, and you set that to true. If you don't set that to true, even if you set the window background to transparent, it won't be transparent. This is a really important point, and we'll come back to that, what the implications of that is. Then, from the first activity, I just need to pass some information to the second activity, start it, and remember to tell the framework not to do any default transition because I'm going to do the transition myself. So just by calling this, you avoid any default transitions. Really quickly, to extract the information from the view, so view generally is the view you clicked on, you can just call get location on screen. We'll give you the absolute position, the left and top, and width and height for the size. So it's really 4 little ints that you put in a bundle, and you pass it to the second activity. So far, so good, right? Now, in the activity that's actually going to animate, we have to do kind of the same gymnastic as the older API, which is you don't want to start the animation right away because you're not ready for it yet. You probably need to load some data or load an image. Oh, wow. Sorry about that. Too many meetings, right? All right. So, same kind of gymnastic. You don't want to start the animation right away. So the first thing you're going to do is actually make your content, if you have any, hidden. You want to set it visible gone or something until you're sure that everything is ready to play that enter animation. So again, generally in my case, it would be just in the callback of a Picasso or something like that. You can call on UI ready. And here, this is a common trick when you do animations. You don't start the animation right away. Does anyone know why? Do you have any idea why I don't start the animation right away? Well, that's because the layout system, how it works, if I start the animation right away and I need somehow to do any calculations with the width and height of the views and stuff, at this point, it's not laid out yet. At the end of this, method is going to request the layout, it's going to do this thing, but I don't have any of the width and height information that I need. So this is a trick that you should keep in mind that's really useful, is instead you add a PreDrawListener to the view that's going to be animated, for example, or any of the view in the hierarchy. And this has the interesting property that when this callback is fired, you're guaranteed to have the onMeasure and onLayout passes of the layout mechanism already finished, ready to go. That means that if you need to do any calculation with the width and height of the views, guaranteed to have it. So there's no other callbacks to add or weird values that can come up. So in that PreDrawListener, as we said when we broke it down, you prepare the scene and then you run the animation. So prepare the scene, really simple. I just grab the final position of the view where it's going to be at the end of the animation, do the delta with the original position, which is passed via the intent. So here's my view info extras. And set that as a translation X and Y of the new view, the final view, called destination view here. And I do the same thing for the width and height, just so that my final view has the same position and the same size as the original view. And this is all I need to prepare kind of my scene, because I have a transparent activity and I know that the view I'm going to animate is exactly positioned where the user clicked, right? So I'm all set. This is a perfect setup. Now all I have to do is just use the good old View Animator APIs, start the animation to its default position and scale, and that's it. You get a nice expansion of this view into its final place in the new activity. And as you can see, it doesn't feel like navigating to a new activity at all. It's very natural. And I found that this adds a lot of value to your app. It just makes it much easier to use, and it just feels more lightweight to open and exit of pictures. So here, you're in your second activity. You have full control. You have access to all your views. You can do whatever you want. And so here's a great place to add extra little fun stuff, like the ripple background that I added. I also animate those buttons at the end. So full control. Right? You're in your activity. You do whatever you want. So to recap, just pass some information via the intent, start it transparent, set my destination view to the right position, play the animation, and I'm done. Wasn't that easy? It wasn't very hard, right? So why don't we always do this? Why is there even a new API that only appears in Lollipop? It's because there's a little catch. And the catch, I forgot this slide. So just to exit the activity, it's easy as well. You just animate back to the initial values, so you keep it as fills. And at the end of the animation, you go finish, And you don't forget to tell the framework not to do any default transitions. And you get that just animate back into where the original view was. So everything looks easy and all that. There's a little catch that they don't tell you. And God damn it. Sorry about that. Oh, what was it? Drinks? Oh, God. These people. Damn, I had a good thing there. I had like your attention. Okay, so it was easy to implement, right? Like I didn't find any blockers or I didn't run into any walls. It just worked on all API levels. It works on KitKat. It works even on Gingerbread. If with the support library for the view animator and stuff. So what's the catch here? Why did I even have a new API for this? And the catch is this little flag right here. The Windows translucent. It has some implication. And it just, if you look at there's no documentation for theme attributes, which is another problem. But if you look on the web for this, there's not much. You don't really understand the cost of it unless you dig a little bit deeper in the graphics pipeline. So I just play with it, poked at it, see where it starts breaking. So this is what I found out. First of all, when you start the translucent activity, the underlying activity only goes through on pause. It doesn't go through on stop. So this is kind of the equivalent of just pressing the home button or the recent button. So that's not a big deal, right? Because usually you release like heavy stuff in your on pause anyway. So that's not too bad. That's actually completely fine. Overdraw, the first thing I thought is like, oof, it's going to be a lot of overdraw. It's probably going to add the overdraw of my underlying activity and add the overdraw of my top activity. Turns out not at all. The Windows system is smart enough to actually make your underlying activity kind of your new background, and it doesn't like add up all the layers of your underlying activity. So overdraw is not an issue, but you still see the underlying activity, at least during the transition if you don't make it opaque. So it's still drawing something. So what is really happening? And to understand what's happening, I need to tell you a little bit about the hardware composer and surface flinger. So don't get too scared. It's going to be very high level, and I'm sure you're going to understand. So this is you. You're here. These are your new friends. And let me present you as friends. So your app, you're talking drawing commands to Surface Flinger. You're telling, hey, I need to draw this. This is my activity. Draw these things. System UI is also talking to Surface Flinger, saying, hey, I need to draw the status bar and the nav bar. And Surface Flinger, his job is to kind of take all this input and produce a nice list of layers. This list of layers is kind of like the equivalent of the windows that you have in your app. And it's going to take that list of layers and pass it to the hardware composer here. So the hardware composer is actually a little piece of hardware that's controlled by the display manufacturers. So it's part of the hardware of the display. But it has a little CPU in there, and it can do some tasks. One of the tasks it does is when Surface Flinger gives him, hey, can you draw these layers? He will reply, yes, I can take these layers, compose them together, pass them to the display. Because the manufacturer implements that, they can do really smart stuff, and it's very like custom to the device. But there's always a common like abstraction layer interface to always talk to the same way to Surface Flinger. So when it says like, hey, yeah, I can take them and pass it to the display, no problem. That's where the rendering kind of phase ends. But sometimes the hardware composer says, I can't draw these layers. Like this is too much for me. So it goes back to Surface Flinger in this case, and Surface Flinger is pass it down to the GPU, and the GPU will do the composition of all these layers together and then pass it back up to Surface Flinger, which would pass it back all processed and ready to be displayed back to the hardware composer in the display. So once you understand this, you can actually visualize it on your own apps really easily with this adb shell command. So adb shell dumps this surface flinger will output a dump of interesting information. But the most interesting information is this little chart right here, or like grid. And this is the actual layers that I'm talking about. This is the layers that the surface flinger has composed together from its input. So what do we have? Right now, I'm just in my list activity, like my main activity. So it's rendering that as a layer. And then it has status bar and navigation bar. So here we have 3 layers. And the response of the hardware composer, it's a little bit cut here, but is what you see on the left. So here, the hardware composer was like, yep, I can take those, no problem. I can compose those together, pass it to the display. Cool. Now, what happens when you start a translucent activity on top of the main activity? So detail activity here is my translucent activity. And if I run adb shell dumps this surface flinger again, now I see 4 layers. So just so you realize, if detail activity was not translucent, didn't have that little flag to true, it would still have been 3 layers, but detail activity would have replaced main activity here. So it will be something like that. But because it's translucent, now I have 2 layers from my app that surface flinger has to pass down to our composer. But as you can see on the left here, our composer is still happy. He can still take all that, no problem. Where it starts getting a little bit different is when you start stacking these translucent activities on top of each other. So like you keep starting those activities, and so I played around and see what happened. And as you can see, the first 4 layers, our composer was happy. He took them, composed them, passed them to display, but the rest had actually to go through the GPU and be processed by the GPU before being passed to the display. So what's the real cost here? Is it like a huge deal? It's not terrible. It's like the price of one of these layers is like 1 layer of overdraw, basically. You can think of it like that. So it's not free. You have to keep it in mind, but it's not terrible either, and it only happens if you start stacking those translucent activities on top of each other. So, by the way, you can always assume that the hardware composer on most of the devices can handle 4 layers all by itself. The reason is that if you just run this surface flinger thing on your launcher, you will actually see 4 layers. Status bar, nav bar, and the launcher has an image wallpaper activity, and on top of it, it has the launcher activity with the actual icons, and that's the translucent one. So just so to make sure that the launcher at least works, most of the manufacturers, they handle 4 layers correctly. But so this is what you have to keep in mind. This is the thing, this kind of the hidden cost, is that yes, we can do activity transitions manually with the method I just showed you. The only thing you gotta keep in mind is that you can't really just keep stacking them. So if you have a deep navigation and you want to reuse like these transitions or have different transitions on this, at the end, you're gonna like keep stacking these layers, and what it's gonna do is gonna use more and more GPU processing power just to display your app, where that GPU power instead should be, for your own app, like playing videos, stuff like something more heavy, like playing other animations, etc. So this is like kind of like a quota that's always going through the GPU if you stay in that state. Now, interesting thing, I kept poking around with this thing because I wanted to see how my device reacted. If you just launch an activity, so normal 3 layers, right? And then you launch a dialog on top of it, it will actually start getting into the GPU as well, because when you start a dialog, it has actually a dim layer, that's 1 layer, and then the dialog window. So you already have your activity, dim layer, dialog, status bar, navigation bar, that's already 5. And so you can hit the GPU here. So not an enormous cost, but you shouldn't stay in this state all the time in your app. It should be kind of a transient thing if you're going through the GPU. But then again, if it's just like kind of a leaf activity, and you just it's kind of a viewer, or you can't really go that deep from that point, this is perfectly fine, and it's almost free because the display hardware can handle it perfectly. So that's the only gotcha. We went a little bit deep now in the hardware. Let's get back up in the high level and recap a little bit. So if you want to do these shared element transitions, add that personality to your app, make it stand out a little bit, two ways. If you're only targeting Lollipop and above, I would suggest just go with the Lollipop API. So if you have the luxury, you're lucky. You're very lucky. Not all of us have this luxury, but the Lollipop API has some advantages. It's not much code. You don't have to know how to write animation code. You don't have even not write animation code at all if you're happy with the built-in ones. And those ones, you don't have to worry about stacking them or any GPU thing, because the framework will handle that for you. And this is why they had to do a new API, because there's a new private API to do this toggling between translucent and non-translucent for your activities. And that's what they're doing under the hood. But obviously, out of the built-in animations, if you want to do something crazy like that ripple background, very hard to do with the Lollipop API. You have to kind of fit into their way of doing things. It's not the very straightforward view animator APIs that we're all used to. And of course, only works on Lollipop and above. On the other hand, the retrocompatible way, if you're up for it, if you understand the consequences of that translucent activity flag, and you don't stack them too heavy, you can make all of your users enjoy these nice transitions, and it's very straightforward to implement. It's very flexible because you're in your activity, you have full control, you do everything you want, but of course it's manual. So if you want to add a little touch, everything you do it yourself. There's no magic. On the other hand, if something breaks, it's you that broke it, not the framework, which is reassuring. And so, as I mentioned, be careful with stacking these translucent activities. Again, if you just add one and then go back to an opaque activity, you're back to 3 layers. So you can just keep toggling around between these states, and you're completely fine. That's it. So I hope you got your lesson. You understand what your weapons are to bring transitions to your activity, and I hope you make Steve Ballmer proud and add some to your own apps. Thank you very much. That was my talk. And of course, I'll be happy to take any questions. I think we have 10 minutes. Yeah. 10. Yeah, so that's a really good question. The question is, as soon as you have one translucent activity, does it stay in the layer list of the surface flinger? So no, it doesn't. As soon as you will launch an opaque activity, it will just forget about the underlying ones because it knows that it doesn't have to draw it, right? So you will go back to 3 layers. That's why you can really get away with this if you just make sure that the transition, you cannot navigate into another transition, but in fact, just go back to a normal kind of flow and kind of toggle back and forth between these 2 states, and you're completely fine. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question. So the question is, what happens if I rotate my activity that animated and now I exit? How do I know how to animate back into place? So this is one of the edge cases that you have to handle yourself. Several ways. Usually the easy way is just to say, if I rotate it, so that's easy to know, right? With the save instance on Cray, you can know if you have to replay the transition or not, and you can know if something has changed underneath. Usually what I do, I would just fall back to some default transition in that case, because it's unless you really know what happened after the transition in your underlying activity and exactly what the position is going to be yet, which is possible if you control your UI well, it's going to be hard to transition back into the same place. So I would say the easier and safest bet is just at that point you're like, sorry, I can't animate back, and just like kind of either fade it out or slide it down or something. Yes. So is the question like how do you hide the original view from the first activity? Yeah, so that's a really good point, and this is like, again, like this is where you get, if you want to really get it right, you have to like do some workarounds. But basically, one thing that you can do is, because your underlying activity is only paused, you actually can still like kind of talk to it. And so depending on your timing on what you need to do, sometimes it's a bit hard to like kind of make the view disappear right as the new view is ready to animate. So it depends on your use case, but you could think of like if you start a fade animation on the first thing, or like, one thing that actually works that is not pretty, you could actually maybe even use like kind of a static state that all your activities kind of talk to, and you can maybe with event bus or something like that, you can actually say from my first activity, send an event, and because your activity is only paused, it's actually still alive. So if you say that listener, I actually want to keep it alive and listen on events on that, and so you can actually talk to the underlying activity through that mechanism. Not the cleanest, but if you really want to achieve that effect, it's a possibility. And then coming back, you actually have an activity result for that. You can start with the request code and come back with the request code that you know, and in that activity result, you can know what you have to do to your original view to make it reappear nicely. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so the question is, how do you handle like sometimes views, like because they're drawn over the previous activity, they're like drawn over the toolbar and everything is kind of glitchy. So this is one of the things where it's so nice to have the flexibility of the Retrocompatible API, because you can really control everything very finely. One easy thing that you can do, and this is actually, I had to implement this, again, like, developers are lazy, so they find weird solutions. But if the problem is that you tap on a view that's actually partially covered by the toolbar. So because you start a new activity on top, like there's no way to like kind of clip it or whatever. The easiest thing I found is actually when you tap that and you know that it's partially covered. Generally, it's in a list because that's the only way that you can make it overlap. So you actually scroll the list down first, just enough so it's out, is not covered anymore, and then start the activity. And that has a really kind of natural effect. Just slides a little bit and boom, and comes in, and that works really well. All right. Of course, you can keep asking any questions on Twitter. Hit me up, follow me, and I'll be happy to answer any. Thank you so much.